Hey everyone, this is Zico Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at some of the biggest papers and finds from January 2023. I'm going to try and condense them into pretty short snippets, so be sure to check out the papers if you're that interested in any of them. That all said, let's get started. Euparkeria is a fossil animal that is kind of the archosaur. And when I say the archosaur, essentially whenever anybody is studying the early archosaurs that evolved during the Triassic, they really like to just kind of look at Euparkeria and see what was it doing. Euparkeria is an animal that's used to understand a lot of archosaur evolution. Check out my video on Smock to understand a little bit more about what that means, at least relative to that animal, and explaining it a bit broadly. But basically, archosaurs are reptiles that stood upright. So you have some things like crocodilians, but also pterosaurs and dinosaurs in that group. Now, Euparkeria isn't a crocodilian or a dinosaur. It actually is a bit earlier than either of those two groups, but it is the first known archosaur. So if we can understand kind of what it was doing with its movement, we can potentially understand how different modes of transportation and different movement evolved in these other groups, because their hips are a little bit different in crocodilians versus in dinosaurs. There's also been some suggestions that Euparkeria may have been bipedal, but this paper found that it probably wasn't. It was much more four-legged, and it really wasn't going to be able to get around well just using two legs. Now, the thing is, later in the Triassic, there were obviously bipedal dinosaurs like Coelophysis, but also bipedal crocodilian relatives like Postosuchus. So this is really important for understanding how they actually got from, again, this initial four-legged quadrupedal stance into becoming bipedal. And what it seems like is that the Pseudosuchians, the crocodilian relatives, and also the dinosaurs and their relatives evolved bipedality entirely separately from one another. So this developed multiple times within the lineage of the archosaurs. Because seemingly once you start getting at least a little bit upright as a reptile, it's not a terrible idea to just keep that going and actually free up the front limbs to actually be a little more useful for being able to grab things and kind of interact with the environment a little bit differently. Sticking with an archosaur, we're actually going to be looking at birds because they are dinosaurs and dinosaurs are archosaurs. And this one, Cratonavis zhui, is this new bird coming from China. And it's actually kind of exciting because its head doesn't have quite the kinetic skull that we normally expect in birds. So a kinetic skull is just meaning that essentially when it bites or moves its jaw around, the bones move significantly in relation to one another. It's really easy to see in things like parrot beaks where there's a lot of movement. So you can kind of see that there, but dinosaurs didn't have that. They had an akinetic skull. Essentially, all the bones stayed in their places all the time. They didn't move around at all. Cratonavis is actually really interesting though, because again, it has that kind of more non-avian dinosaur skull, but the rest of the body, it's a bird. It has the pygostyle for kind of making the tail fan of feathers at the end of it. It has well-developed feathers and probably was flying around quite a bit. It also had large claws on its feet that it was probably using to try and grab different prey off of tree branches or off the ground. So what this really means is, as much as we like to think, oh, bird evolution was very straightforward, they just started flying and developed all of these very classical bird traits, no, there was a lot of different steps that were taken in the bird evolution. It wasn't something where all of the different adaptations showed up all at once. It was a much slower process. Still sticking with skulls, we're looking at the skull of an Iniopteran, which this is a group of fish that are actually a lot closer to things like chimeras and ratfish, which themselves are closer to sharks, than to any kind of bony fish. And they were really diverse during the Carboniferous. And these researchers looked at just one of them, Iniopera, and tried to understand how it would have fed, and what they found is it could open its mouth really wide. And this is really important for understanding how it probably fed, because that means it's probably a high-performance suction feeder, kind of like many anglerfish and frogfish are today. And they also had these kind of weird fins on their sides that I think somebody should do muscle work and try and see if maybe they were used like frogfish fins were in order to kind of help it walk across reefs and if they were feeding that way. Because they really are some of the most bizarre fish in the fossil record. And at least now we know how they probably fed, but understanding where exactly they did that feeding on the bottom of the seafloor or out in the water column would be really nice to know. And there's still other animals that fed in the water, although this one is a pterosaur, so we're jumping kind of out of the water. This is a new pterosaur named Balaenognathus maeuseri. And the name kind of gives up a little bit of how it fed because Baleen is derived from baleen whales. And so, yeah, it was filter feeding. It had all of these teeth lining its jaws, and it would have been able to kind of just suck up small particles of plankton and zooplankton and just eat those. It also had this kind of expanded tip at the end of its snout, And some of the researchers are suggesting, okay, so it probably just stood towards the direction the water was coming, and it would have essentially added more surface area for things to enter the mouth, and then, again, just filter feeding, pushing that water out, but leaving all the zooplankton in. I'm not entirely sold on this idea. It comes from marine sediments, and that means there's tides, so it's going to have to shift its body quite a bit while feeding in order to actually try and be able to maintain that position towards the direction of water. Instead, what I might suggest, and I'm not a pterosaur researcher, so I may not be the best person to do this, I think we should be looking more at things like roseate spoonbills, which also have the expanded tip of the snout and are a little bit more active when they're feeding. But again, that's going to take some time to actually try and understand if that's what Balaenognathus was doing. And we're sticking with food even still, this time in ornithischian dinosaurs. This is the group that's mostly herbivorous, and so when we're actually looking at these, I mean, they all evolved from the same common ancestor, but their jaws actually developed a lot of different mechanics for trying to actually process plant food. And when we try and understand that, that means that essentially, sure, they ancestrally probably at least were omnivorous early on. There's some animals like Heterodontosaurus and early Ornithischian, which seems like it still had some canine teeth for grabbing smaller lizards and things like that. But again, mostly eating plants. So ancestrally, we can say they were probably mostly eating plants, although there may have been a little bit of variation in there. The later ones, though, like I said, they have a lot of different solutions to how to process plants, which means even with the same starting material in a group, you're going to get very different organisms that are actually feeding in different ways and using different parts of the ecosystem. And so evolution isn't necessarily that predictable. We can't look at one organism and go, it's using these muscles and these kinds of teeth to process plants and go, this one's related to it. It must be doing the same thing. Instead, we need to look a little bit more broadly at the actual mechanics being involved. And still sticking with things that are eating, but this time we're not actually looking at the head, which sounds counterintuitive, but we're looking at the Theropod dinosaur, which a lot of the large ones had big heads and little arms, but that is not the case for the Megaraptorans. The Megaraptorans had really, really beefy arms. In fact, the first claws found were thought to have been from dromaeosaurs, so things like Utahraptor or Velociraptor, and that's why they got the name Megaraptor. It's like, it must be a really, really big one. And then researchers realized, that's a hand, not a foot. But they could actually be pretty large. Maepe is just one example that's approaching the size of the other largest theropod dinosaurs, like some of the tyrannosaurs and carcharodontosaurs. So it's not like this actually hindered them. They did quite well, and there's actually some stuff I'm going to talk about with them in a minute that shows how well they did. But again, the important part here is just they had really beefy arms, and this paper looked to see if they could understand how they used them. And from what it seems like, they used them the same way as any other theropod dinosaur. It's not like they had any kinds of new muscles that they had evolved in order to help with their grip or anything. It's just those muscles were larger. So while some things like many of the carcharodontosaurs and tyrannosaurs were essentially shrinking their arms, the Megaraptorans just went, no, we're just gonna all in on the arms. Now that doesn't mean the arms are exactly like those of the other theropods. There's some indications that they probably had a little bit more ability to flex, meaning essentially they had a better range of motion, and when they were doing that range of motion, especially flexing inwards, that was probably really important for them, and that means they fed in some way that the other theropod dinosaurs didn't, or at least they hunted in a way that the other theropod dinosaurs didn't. And for how successful they were, there's a new paper that describes some Megaraptoran material coming from the southernmost part of Chile in the Patagonia region. And it's not just Megaraptorans. There's a number of different theropods found there, including some unulagian dromaeosaurs and some birds. Like there's a lot of stuff knocking about in this part of Chile. And this is just before the impact during the Campanian and the Maastrichtian, the last two stages of the Cretaceous, just before, Big Rock comes and kills everything. So it's showing that these groups were doing pretty dang well. Unfortunately, there's only one bird from the Maastrichtian rocks out here, but it's pretty likely that we'll find more. I mean, that's just kind of part of paleontology is, here's our preliminary find. We can start making some assumptions about the overall community because we have a lot of different things, but hopefully we'll find some more complete things to be able to make better inferences about that environment. And sticking with new theropods that are really, really fragmentary, there's new material coming from India in the Middle Jurassic. And the Middle Jurassic has a really, really bad fossil record. Like this stuff from Chile, this stuff can't be named to any specific species, but we can at least narrow down the likely group, which is just that it's not a Coelurosaur, which are a lot of the more bird-like theropod dinosaurs, but also large things like Tyrannosaurus rex. Instead, it's probably from either a ceratosauran, a megalosaur, or an allosauriod. So it's not exactly narrowed down as well as we would hope, but hey, new material from the Middle Jurassic. And with any luck, there will be, like I said in Chile, more fossils found where we can actually start understanding these organisms better. But of course, the dinosaurs all evolved in the Triassic, or at least first evolved in the Triassic. And there were other things evolving then too, including some really small things that are still alive today, such as the caecilians. And I'm not talking about the island off of the coast of Italy. Instead, I'm talking about this strange group of amphibians that are kind of worm-like. They have tiny little eyes and weird tentacles that they use to sense different chemicals with, and mostly live underground. But we actually have a fossil from an early one that suggests, okay, well, it started to separate from things like frogs and salamanders, but it wasn't underground just yet. And that's because this new fossil, Funkusvermis gilmori, doesn't have a lot of the traits we normally associate with caecilians. Namely, that tentacle I mentioned. Normally inside the bone, there's a little tube coming out of it, so nervous system parts can actually reach that part of the tentacle. It doesn't have that kind of access point for a tentacle. There's not nerves, or at least not large nerves, coming through the skull. Also, there's a large eye, or at least a large part of the eye. It's not an entire fossil, it's actually coming from microfossil sites, meaning essentially you have to sift through this sand and mud and find little fragments of bone. But again, one of these actually shows just the corner of the orbit, and it's a lot larger than any of the modern caecilians' eyes are. So that means it was potentially living more above ground, at least relative to modern caecilians, and then eventually as they started to begin burrowing more and more, you start to see the shrinking of the eye and the development of that other sensory organ. I also like this one because it was found pretty close to me in northern Arizona. I actually have a friend working out a paper who one of his colleagues had to write an article about this because, hey, it's neat and exciting and good for small rural northern Arizona for their paper. And it's also good for anyone who wants to know more about how these strange animals evolved. Additionally, it's actually potentially a direct precursor to another caecilian that was found in slightly younger rocks. So essentially a lot of the early fossil ones we found come from this part of Arizona, but they don't live here now because they're basically equatorial. Arizona though, at that time in the Triassic, was equatorial. So what that really means is they haven't really changed their lifestyle that much, other than maybe going underground. Because essentially they would have stuck at the equator, and then as the continents moved, they're like, oh, North America's moving north, time for me to migrate south because I want to hang around the equator. It's really interesting to start getting some of these fossils and better understand kind of how these groups started to evolve, and in some cases how they didn't change very much. Before the Triassic though, there was the Permian, and the end of the Permian was a devastating extinction that killed off a lot of groups. I'm just going to kind of summarize it there, but lots of death and destruction for the animals that were around at that time. This also includes the insects, which this is the only mass extinction that has significantly affected them. And based on our genetic data, we can say, hey, yeah, most of the modern insect groups, they split from one another before that extinction. But the kind of question that people are asking is, well, did they just split from one another, or was it distinctly what it was? In order to explain this, it's essentially, you have the lineage that's going to lead towards things like wasps. And sure, genetic data says it split before that extinction. But did we have anything with all of the characteristics of a wasp before or after the Triassic? Based on this large summary of the majority of insect fossils we have from before this extinction, it seems like no, essentially the precursors to wasp were around, but they weren't yet wasps. You actually had to wait until that extinction and the few lineages that actually made it through that extinction to start to evolve to the new environment before you start getting things that are much more familiar to us. So it's a much longer process, and again, it's kind of twofold. Hey, there's already this diversification happening, extinction cuts off a lot of it, and then we start to get the modern groups that we are more familiar with today. And there's also some fossils of broader groups diverging, such as metazoans, which are just animals. All animals are metazoans. And their closest relatives have been considered to be choanoflagellates, which are single-celled but can form colonies, and they have this little flagellum at the end that they use to swim around with. And now there's fossils of them, but they're fossils from the Cretaceous, which kind of sucks because that's, between 145 and 66 million years ago, as opposed to when they would have first evolved over 600 million years ago. So it's not early choanoflagellates, but at least now we know that we can probably get some fossils of them, and it's just a matter of looking in the right places. And as for the Cretaceous and the dates of specific rocks, there was a paper looking at the age of the yellow cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation. What you need to understand about different rock formations, such as things like the famous Morrison Formation, is they're broken up into subunits called members. And so again, this is just one member of the Cedar Mountain Formation. And it's been generally thought to have been about 110 million years old. This data suggests it's closer to 135 million years old. So, you're just pushing it back 15 million years, which doesn't sound like a lot until you start processing that the continents are still all drifting during this time. There's not necessarily as much migration between the continents, especially Asia and North America at this time, as you might expect. Yet we still find large dromaeosaurs in this part of North America, specifically Utahraptor. Previously, it was thought that potentially the dromaeosaurs, even things like Utahraptor, started in Asia and then migrated to North America. So this just means that potentially Asia and North America were in contact earlier than previously thought, or maybe dromaeosaurs were just on more of the continents than we previously thought. Maybe they were still evolving into things like Utahraptor in North America. And still in the Cretaceous, there's been some weird isotopes in some of the rocks. Isotopes are just when atoms of the same element weigh different amounts. It's pretty straightforward, and you can put them through fancy machinery and understand which isotopes are present. And again, Cretaceous rocks have had some really, really weird isotopes. And that also isn't just in the rocks, it's also in the teeth of some dinosaurs. There's been studies of the isotopes to try and understand what different food sources different animals were trying to eat. And that's because there's generally 3 different types of photosynthesis. There's C3, C4, and CAM. And they all do slightly different things, but the important part is they collect different types of isotopes of carbon. And so by looking at the isotopes in the teeth of dinosaurs, they're like, oh, well, you are what you eat. Whatever isotopes the dinosaur is getting from its environment, that's going to get brought into the teeth. And so it's like, hey, look, they're mostly eating C3 plants. This paper went, okay, we need to stop and consider if that's actually the case, though. What if there's just some weird anomaly in that environment? And that's what they did. They took samples from a lot of different animals in the environment, and they all plotted closer to C3 plants with their relative isotope ratios. The fossils they were looking at actually come from kind of a swampy environment in what is now Canada, but essentially they wanted to go, okay, well, maybe it's just swampy type environments that have this kind of bias towards seeming like there's more C3 plants. And so they looked at a modern bayou in Louisiana. No, they don't have the same carbon ratios. So it's something that's more specific to the specific dinosaur park formation where these fossils come from that's actually causing this influence of the isotopes. It's something very specific, and why when you're doing these kinds of studies, you need to kind of look at a broad swath of animals in order to try and understand if you're getting an actual signal or if it's just some kind of interference or general trend that doesn't actually tell you anything. And on the subject of that kind of isotope stuff, there was a paper last year looking at Miracinonyx, or the American cheetah, and the isotopes in some of its collagen, because there's some pretty recent fossils of the American cheetah. And they found a lot of different things, potentially that it wasn't running after super fast prey like pronghorn, the way it has been suggested, but these authors essentially went, okay, well, was it actually hunting like a cheetah? Is this something we should expect? And we can check that by doing other things than just isotope analysis. Sometimes we can just look at the bones. And so they looked at the elbow of Miracinonyx and compared it to the modern day cheetah and Miracinonyx's closest living relative, the puma. And what they found is that the elbow is kind of in the middle between the cheetah and the mountain lion, which means it's not running as fast as a cheetah, but potentially not grappling in quite the same way as the mountain lion. Instead, it's probably doing some other strange third thing that we don't really know what that is yet. It's an unfortunate reality with paleontology that you're not always going to get perfect information. All you can kind of do sometimes is cut out specific ideas, like it's probably not running as fast as a cheetah, it's probably doing some other strange thing. And that brings us to human evolution, which is, frankly, it's a crapshoot. Because a lot of these fossils were found in really quick proximity to one another, and because it's human evolution, there was a lot of pressure to publish as much as they could, as quick as they could. And that means some of the care about understanding the different relationships between early hominids isn't quite as good as it should be. And so, for example, Australopithecus is famously the ancestor to humans, except there's been more studies that have said, no, actually, they kind of branched off and did their own thing, and then there was another branch of hominids that went to humans. So it's really hard to say for sure, because again, a lot of this kind of taxonomic work and just parsing which ones are which hasn't been done. And this paper tried to do that by looking at Australopithecus sediba. And as a disclaimer, I am not a human evolution person. I'm not that familiar with it. So I'm gonna just try and lay down the basic bare bones of what happened, which is essentially they went, well, this one doesn't quite line up with the other Australopithecus species, which means we need to just, again, run these kinds of phylogenies again. And what they found is Australopithecus sediba probably should not be considered Australopithecus because it's actually much closer to humans than the other species of Australopithecus are. That said, the other Australopithecus species do kind of form a trend back towards humans in the genus Homo. So there's still going to need to be a lot more work done on this, but it is interesting and good that some people are finally actually starting to take a look at some of these hominid fossils and trying to understand what exactly the process was. And that brings us to papers that I've already done entire videos on, so quick summaries of those. There's 200 and some odd eggs found in India of titanosaurs. And there's some variation in kind of the shapes and structures in the shell, meaning there's probably at least 6 different species of sauropods knocking about in late Cretaceous India. So they were still doing pretty well there. There's also the paper on T-Rex brains that said, hey, maybe it's as smart as a baboon, and there's a lot that goes into this. It probably wasn't. There's some issues with the paper that need to be considered a little more in depth, but the thing is there are people who study fossil brains, or at least try to, and I imagine the author of this paper and the author of those papers are gonna, meet up and discuss how to go about the next steps of questioning. So hopefully that'll all go well, and there won't be some giant controversy like this again. There's also a paper looking at a bird that has a modern day raptor claw on its toe, and it's not quite as dramatic as many of the dromaeosaurs had, but it's good for understanding how they probably used them, and probably a little bit more as a grappling hook than as some sort of slashing weapon. And then finally there's gladiatorial combat in trilobites. They're, using their tridents to fight one another. Then it's been suggested, hey, maybe they were using them to find food. There's one that has a really weird one, and if they were using it to find food, probably wouldn't have been able to find food that well, and it's still almost full size. So that's a really good indicator that they probably weren't using it for food, because that individual would have starved before it got to full size. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you want to check out my Splunked video, you can click on one of those sites. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Be sure to check out our Patreon, where you can come in and interact with some of this. We're going to try and start doing some live streams. Also check out the Discord. We post papers and occasionally watch things like Walking with Dinosaurs and whatnot. Be safe, take care, don't go extinct.